He never came home at that hour, and maybe that's why no one was prepared to see him standing there. Before you listen to this story, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love knowing how far our stories travel. The front door clicked shut behind Daniel with a muted snap, swallowed by the kind of quiet that didn't belong in a house with two young children. It wasn't the absence of sound that unsettled him. It was the presence of something else, a stillness that felt wrong. Too intact, too deliberate. He dropped his keys on the console, expecting the usual explosion of life, pounding footsteps, little voices shouting his name, toys tumbling across the wood floor. Nothing. Only the echo of his own breath, louder than it should have been. His afternoon meeting had been cancelled at the last minute. For anyone else, it would have been an inconvenience. For Daniel, it felt like a test. An unexpected push back into a place he'd avoided ever since the day his world split in two. He rubbed his face, trying to shake off the weight of numbers, demands and decisions that never seemed to end. But halfway down the hallway, something stopped him. A smell, not perfume, not cleaning products. Food. Warm, real, homemade food. Something his home hadn't held since before his wife died. He froze. For a brief second, he felt time fold in on itself, as if he'd stepped into an old memory he'd fought hard to bury. But this wasn't nostalgia, and it wasn't a hallucination. There was something new in the air. The smell led to the kitchen, and woven into it, a voice, soft, low, almost sacred. Daniel followed the sound, moving slowly, each step tightening something in his chest. It wasn't conversation, it was something else, a prayer. The last time he heard that tone inside this house, his wife was still alive. He stopped at the doorway, and the scene hit him like a blow he never saw coming. On the colorful rug that was always a little crooked, his two children knelt side by side, heads bowed, hands clasped, eyes closed, as if someone had guided them gently into a place where fear couldn't reach. And in the center, her hands resting over their small heads, was Maya. The nanny he'd hired in a rush, without questions, without energy, without anything besides the desperate need for someone to hold the house together while he survived his grief. She spoke quietly, just loud enough for the children to hear, but soft enough that the words stayed inside the walls of that room. A simple prayer. But Daniel felt something heavy in it, something true, something he couldn't name. His oldest looked calm for the first time in weeks. The younger one leaned against her leg, breathing like a child who finally felt safe. Daniel stood still, struck not by emotion, but by something he hadn't felt in months. The house felt alive. And then Maya's voice became clearer. She said a name. His wife's name. Daniel blinked, confused, rigid. He must have misheard. No one said that name in this house, not anymore, not even him. How does she know? The air thickened around him. Maya ended the prayer gently, like someone handling something fragile. Her fingers moved slowly through the children's hair, and her face held a calmness Daniel had never seen here. Not even before the tragedy. He took one step. The floor creaked. Maya's eyes opened first. She lifted her head toward him slowly. No fear, no panic, just quiet surprise. And something else. Not fear of him, fear of having been seen. The children turned, faces lighting up, expecting a welcome home he hadn't known how to give in a long time. "Dad, we were showing Maya Mom's prayer." The ground seemed to tilt under Daniel's feet. The older boy said it so naturally, as if they'd done this many times. But that wasn't possible. That prayer was private, intimate, created between him and his wife alone, never spoken aloud to the children. He couldn't react. He just stared at Maya, who didn't look away, didn't explain, didn't defend herself. There was a truth inside her silence he hadn't asked to know. a truth he wasn't ready for. For the first time since his wife died, Daniel felt the urge to ask, not as a boss, not as a father, but as a man realizing his house might not be as quiet as he believed. But before he could speak, another detail pierced him. Near the counter, covered with a familiar crocheted cloth, sat a plate. The exact kind his wife used whenever she cooked his favorite meal. Something tightened in Daniel's stomach. How did she know the prayer? How did she know the recipe? Why did the children lean into her voice more than into his? None of this was normal, and he was about to discover that this moment was only the first warning. The silence after the prayer wasn't the same as before. Before, it had been empty. Now it felt full of something Daniel couldn't name, something that unsettled him deeply, as if the house had continued living without him noticing. Maya rose slowly, with the gentle precision of someone who knew how to move around children. The boys stayed on the rug, both talking at once, proud of the ritual they'd just shared. "She knows the ending, Dad. The part Mom used to whisper." Daniel's throat tightened. That part of the prayer had never been taught to anyone, not even to him. His wife used to murmur that final line only when she thought she was alone. Thought. Maya waited a moment before speaking again, as if weighing the impact of every word. "They were unsettled today," she said softly. "I thought it might help." Her tone wasn't defensive or intrusive. It was calm, the kind of calm forged by someone who'd soothed storms before. But her eyes, there was something in them Daniel couldn't read, a mix of sadness and caution. He swallowed hard. "Who taught you that part?" Maya hesitated for a fraction of a second, tiny but enough to bother him. "They showed me bits of it. Kids remember more than we think." It was a plausible answer, very plausible. But Daniel knew when someone was sidestepping. He'd negotiated contracts his whole life. He recognized nuance better than most. And yet her confidence irritated him. Not arrogance, the opposite. It was the ease of someone who belonged. Someone who didn't seem out of place in a house that wasn't hers. The boys ran down the hallway shouting something about playing outside before it got dark. Maya straightened the younger one's pajama hem, checked the older's shoelaces, then finally lifted her eyes back to Daniel. And that was when he realized something strange. He barely knew her. He didn't know where she lived, didn't know who her family was, didn't know what she'd done before coming here, didn't even know her exact age. She had been recommended by an old employee he trusted. Daniel had been so exhausted the day he hired her that he hadn't asked a single personal question. He just needed someone, anyone, who could keep the house standing while he tried to survive his own grief. But now, under the warm kitchen light, watching her calm posture, her steady hands, the delicate way she touched every object, she looked like someone who had been part of the house long before she arrived. Daniel drew in a slow breath, searching for control. "You cooked this?" he asked, nodding toward the dish under the crocheted cloth. "Yes." "How did you—" He stopped himself before finishing the question. Maya looked up, and there was something like understanding in her eyes, but also something else he couldn't decipher. "Your oldest told me it was their mother's favorite. I thought it might be good for them." Daniel studied her, trying to find a flaw in the explanation. He didn't find one. But he found something else, something far more disturbing, the way she spoke about his wife. No hesitation, no awkward curiosity, no competitive tone like so many people carried when trying to fill a dead woman's absence. Just respect, a respect so deep it felt personal. He didn't like that feeling, not one bit. "You always pray with them," he pressed. "Only when they need it," she answered gently. "And today, they did." Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but every word felt wrong, petty, unfair, misplaced. Maya wasn't doing anything wrong. If anything, she was doing more for this home than he had managed in months. And maybe that was the part that bothered him the most. He no longer knew how to take care of his own children, and this woman, a stranger he'd hired out of desperation, seemed to understand the soul of the house better than he did. He ran a hand through his hair and cut the conversation short. "If you need anything, I'll be in my office." Of course. But the way she said "of course" carried an unspoken truth. "I know you're not ready for answers." Daniel walked away, but as he moved down the hallway, he noticed something else. The house smelled different when Maya was here. Before, it smelled like absence. Now it smelled like life, and that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. In the office, something on the desk caught his eye. A drawing. 4 figures holding hands, him, the boys, and a 4th figure, a woman wearing a blue dress, the same shade Maya wore that day. It wasn't their mother. Couldn't be. A wave of discomfort tightened in his stomach. Not anger, but something deeper. A displacement, as if the house didn't belong entirely to him anymore. He sat down, trying to understand where exactly he'd lost control. But before his thoughts could take shape, he heard laughter from the backyard, and Maya's voice telling the boys to be careful on the steps. Daniel closed his eyes. There was something unsettling about how naturally her voice fit into that space, as if it had known the backyard long before she ever stepped foot in it. And that changed everything. The next few days unfolded in a strange rhythm, as if the house itself had slipped into a quiet state of observation. Daniel tried to follow his usual routine, meetings, charts, decisions, but something inside him no longer operated with the same mechanical precision. It felt as though someone had tossed a small stone into a lake he believed completely still, and now the ripples were spreading in every direction, unsettling parts of him he didn't want touched. And every ripple began in the same place. Maya. She didn't do anything grand. She didn't interrupt. She didn't impose herself. She didn't invade. She simply existed in the space. And somehow that was enough to make Daniel feel the house had woken up after months of sleeping with its eyes half open. But that afternoon, something happened that he couldn't ignore. His morning meeting ended earlier than planned, a simple cancellation, ordinary, harmless, yet it produced the same imbalance inside him. He hated coming home outside his usual schedule. In the lull of the afternoon, the house belonged to the children and to Maya. And he felt like an intruder there. Still, he drove back. The moment he opened the door, he sensed he wasn't walking into a silent home. The familiar smell of his wife's favorite recipe drifted through the air like an unwelcome memory. Soft, warm, cutting. It didn't hurt all at once. It stung slowly, sharply, like a thin blade dragging across skin. Daniel headed to the kitchen, and he stopped, completely, as if someone had grabbed his arm. Maya stood by the stove in an apron, hair tied loosely, stirring a pot that released a scent so specific, so achingly familiar, it felt like stepping into another time. It wasn't just a family recipe, it was a signature. Something intimate, something alive. His youngest sat on the counter beside her, watching every move with wide, trusting eyes. The oldest stood at her side, calmly chopping vegetables with surprising precision. The scene was effortless, unforced. Natural in a way that felt rehearsed, as if the moment had existed long before Daniel walked through the doorway. None of them heard him arrive. Maya tasted the broth, then looked at the oldest and smiled. "It's almost just like your mom's." Daniel froze. Her voice had no hesitation. She wasn't guessing. She spoke as someone who knew, someone who recognized the taste from memory, not from instructions pieced together by a child. "You think he'll notice?" the boy asked, hopeful. "He will," she answered softly. "But that's what you want, isn't it? For him to remember how good it used to be." Daniel inhaled deeply. but the air felt too thick. He couldn't tell if the feeling rising in him was anger, discomfort, confusion, or something more dangerous. The sensation of being replaced in a space he no longer controlled. He stepped forward. The chair grazed against the tile, breaking the spell. Maya turned. The boys lit up. "Dad, look! We learned Mom's recipe!" Daniel stared at Maya with a silent intensity that bordered on aggression, though he said nothing. His heartbeat felt wrong, fast, uneven, detached from his body. "Who taught this to you?" he asked, his voice firmer than he intended. Maya set the ladle down gently before answering. "It was a mix. They remembered small details, and I put them together." "You put them together," he repeated, disbelief plain in his tone. "Yes." They knew more than they realized. Daniel walked slowly around the kitchen, as if analyzing a scene he wasn't sure he wanted to understand. Her movements were too confident, her gestures too familiar. Everything she touched seemed chosen with an intimacy that didn't make sense. His youngest tugged at his shirt. "She knows Mom's lullaby too, Dad." Daniel leaned closer. "The lullaby?" His voice came out low. "Yeah, the one she used to sing when we went to sleep." Daniel lifted his gaze to Maya. The lullaby had been improvised, created on the spot during a feverish night when the oldest was sick. It wasn't recorded, it wasn't written down, it wasn't anything except memory. "How do you know that song?" he asked, forcing steadiness into his voice. Maya looked down for a brief second, and Daniel saw it, the exact instant she considered lying, and chose not to. "They began humming pieces of it," she said quietly, "and I filled in the rest." A cold shiver crawled up Daniel's spine. Her explanation made sense on the surface, but the way she said it carried a weight she wasn't sharing. Not a lie, but not the whole truth either. He crossed his arms, struggling to regain control of his own posture. "Why do you hesitate every time I ask a simple question?" he pressed. Maya took a slow breath. "Because some things," she said carefully, "aren't simple." The honesty irritated him. She didn't challenge him. She didn't retreat. She didn't fear him. She chose her words like someone who knew exactly where she was stepping. Daniel hated it. He hated how seamlessly she fit into the space, into a home he, the man who owned it, still couldn't inhabit fully. The boys resumed their tasks, laughing, breaking the tension. But the unease stayed, firm, growing, like a shadow that couldn't find a wall to stop against. Maya glanced at Daniel over her shoulder, and something in that look made him pause. It wasn't intimacy. It wasn't familiarity. It was, knowledge. As if she knew something about him he had forgotten himself. In that moment, Daniel understood that there was something about this woman that went far beyond being a nanny, an employee, or a temporary presence. Something he had not granted permission for, something he did not understand, something waiting beneath the surface of this house. And that was precisely what made this moment dangerous. What Daniel didn't know yet was that this would be the first day he realized the true reach of her presence, and nothing that followed would be gentle. The hours began behaving strangely for Daniel. The more he tried to bury himself in numbers, deadlines, and decisions, the more his mind slipped away, back to the same point over and over again: Maya. Her presence crept into his thoughts like a sound repeating in the background, too soft to confront, too persistent to ignore. He started noticing her in places where he shouldn't notice anything at all. The smell of bread baking in the late afternoon, his wife's recipe copied with unbearable precision, a note on the fridge written in the boy's handwriting. Today, Maya taught us how to fold clothes like Mom used to. The hallway arranged in a way only his wife used to do when she said the house needed to breathe. Daniel watched all of it with a mixture of admiration and irritation, as if standing inside a reality he hadn't invited in. That night, he returned home later than usual, expecting silence, chaos, toys scattered everywhere, but instead found the living room glowing with soft yellow light and the sound of the boys' excited voices. He paused in the doorway. Maya was sitting on the floor, the boys lying with their heads in her lap, listening to a story she was making up on the spot. Something about forests, courage, and secret pathways. There was no theatrics, no exaggeration, just belonging. The realization hit him like a silent punch. Maya lifted her eyes when she noticed him, but she didn't rush to explain herself. She simply placed a finger to her lips, asking for quiet, and continued the story in a softer tone. Daniel stood there in the doorway, watching. It wasn't jealousy, not exactly. It was something deeper, something that made the air inside his chest feel crowded. Later, after he put the boys to bed, he found Maya in the kitchen putting glasses away. "Since when do you tell them stories?" he asked, his voice too low to sound authoritative. "Since I realized they needed help falling asleep." "And you just decided that on your own?" Someone needed to decide. The precision of the answer irritated him. She didn't confront him, but she didn't retreat either, and that disarmed him in a way he didn't understand. "I'm their father," he said, harsher than intended. "I know," she replied without irony, "but they don't know how to reach you yet. They're still waiting for you to come back." The words hit him squarely in the chest, because they were painfully true. Maya placed the last cup on the shelf and dried her hands on a towel. The gesture, simple, mundane, looked like it had been done there 1,000 times before. But that was impossible. She hadn't been in the house long enough. Still, the gesture was identical to his wife's, as if the house had taught her, or as if she already knew. Daniel needed to take back control. He needed something concrete, something real, something that made sense. Enough of the déjà vu. The next morning he decided to watch her, just observe. He pretended to leave for work, then quietly returned and stood in the hallway, hidden, listening to every sound. She didn't see him. She didn't know she was being watched. He saw her straighten the pillows with a precision that hurt to look at. He saw the way she paused in front of the old shelf in the living room, the one his wife used to arrange with symbolic objects, with a strange, reverent stillness, as if standing in front of something sacred. He saw her touch the picture frame of his wife and the boys, tracing her finger slowly along the border. No employee would do that. No nanny would do that without permission. No stranger would do that with such familiarity. But that wasn't the part that broke him. It happened later that morning. Their elderly neighbor, a man who'd known his family long before Daniel ever married, approached the fence while Maya hung clothes outside. "Good morning, dear. You look familiar. Have you been around here before?" he asked, squinting. Maya froze, just for a second, a tiny, heavy second. "No, sir. First time." The neighbor nodded, but he didn't look convinced. He lingered, studying her face before slowly walking away. Daniel saw everything. He saw the flicker of tension across her shoulders. He saw how tightly she gripped the clothespin until her fingers turned white. He saw her lift her eyes toward the window, toward his window, not knowing he was watching, and something deep sparked inside him. Later, when she thought she was alone, Daniel saw her enter the boys' room and close the door. He moved quietly, stopping just outside. He heard breathing. He heard stillness. Then he heard something that made him stop breathing altogether. She was crying quietly, as if trying not to disturb anything, not even the walls. Daniel leaned his back against the opposite wall and stayed there, still, listening. He wanted to walk away. He wanted to walk in. He wanted to ask her what was happening. He wanted to pretend he heard nothing, but he didn't move. He stayed there, like someone who senses that something enormous is on the verge of being uncovered, and that he might not be ready for it. When she finally opened the door, she held something in her hands. Something she quickly tucked into her apron pocket the second she noticed someone in the hallway. They looked at each other. Neither said a word. But in that instant, Daniel knew with absolute certainty, Maya wasn't just working in the house. She had a reason for being here, and that reason, whatever it was about to surface. There's no precise way to describe the kind of silence that settles over a house when the truth tries to surface. It isn't the silence of emptiness, nor the familiar quiet of routine. It's thicker, heavier, a silence that seems to gather in corners, cling to objects, linger in unlit spaces. In the days that followed, Daniel began to notice it. He tried to bury himself in work, meetings, tasks, decisions that felt urgent only because he needed them to be. But nothing distracted him from the place where all his thoughts converged. Maya. The connections were impossible to ignore now. The certainty growing inside him that she carried something deeper than her role was impossible to silence, and the memories she stirred in him were impossible to keep buried. But that night, something finally spilled over. He had spent the entire day in his office shuffling through documents that refused to make sense. Late in the afternoon, he heard quiet footsteps in the hallway, Maya getting the boys ready for bed. Daniel hesitated before opening the door. He knew that if he kept avoiding this, the tension would keep spreading, taking root. So he did the opposite. He stepped out. Maya stood in the hallway with a storybook in her hands. The boys were already in their room, whispering to each other, waiting for a bedtime ritual that only made sense when she was there. Maya widened her eyes when she saw him. Not with fear, but with the same cautious alertness she showed whenever he appeared unexpectedly. "Can we talk?" Daniel asked, his voice firmer than intended. She nodded, though she seemed to measure the space between them, as if assessing the ground before taking a step. Before they could begin, the younger boy appeared at the bedroom door, holding a small notebook. Maya gave him a quick, distracted smile. A smile that didn't reach her eyes. "What do you have there?" Daniel asked, approaching. The boy handed him the notebook, a child's sketchbook with colored pages and uneven drawings. But something on the last page made Daniel stop. A drawing of a house. Inside the house, 4 figures. 3 were unmistakable, Daniel and the 2 boys. But the 4th figure caught his attention. A woman wearing a blue necklace. Daniel's stomach tightened. "And who is she?" he asked, forcing his voice to stay steady. The boy beamed as if the answer were obvious. "That's Maya." Daniel felt a deep, unsettling shift. Not because she was in the drawing, but because of the necklace. The blue necklace, the one his wife wore every day, the one that disappeared the night she died. He looked at Maya and saw her avert her gaze for 1 second too long. "Maya," he said, taking a breath, "I need you to come with me." She set the book down and followed him to the office. The door closed behind them, sealing the room in a thick, waiting silence. Daniel remained standing for a long moment, searching for a place to begin. He didn't want to accuse her. He didn't want to hurt her. But he needed answers. "You were crying in the boys' room yesterday," he said plainly, "and when you came out, you hid something in your pocket. I want to know what it was." Maya lowered her eyes. She didn't deny it. She didn't invent excuses. "I should have told you sooner," she whispered, her voice cracking on the last word. "Then tell me now." She took a slow, steady breath, the kind someone takes before opening a door they've kept locked for far too long. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small object wrapped in a worn piece of white cloth. She placed it gently on the desk and unfolded the fabric. Daniel felt the air catch in his throat. It was the necklace. His wife's necklace. the one that had been missing since the night she died. The blue pendant looked duller now, scratched across the surface, as if it had been gripped too tightly or torn away in a moment of panic. Daniel stood frozen, staring at it as though it were a shard of a memory he had fought hard to bury, now forcing its way back with brutal clarity. "How did you get this?" he asked, his voice low, almost hoarse. Maya clasped her hands together. "She gave it to me," she said simply, the kind of honesty that left no room for retreat. Daniel's eyes widened, shock mixing with disbelief and something dangerously close to anger. "That's impossible," he murmured. "She never mentioned you, not once." Maya lifted her face. Her eyes were full of sorrow, not guilt, not fear. Sorrow. "She didn't tell you," Maya said, her voice trembling but resolute. "She didn't tell anyone." The silence between them wasn't empty. It was a rupture, something collapsing inside Daniel while something else rearranged itself in the space left behind. "I didn't come to this house by accident," Maya continued softly. "Your wife asked me to, long before she got worse." Daniel gripped the edge of the desk. "Who are you?" he whispered. Maya took another breath, slow, heavy, and her expression carried a gravity Daniel had never seen in her. "I was her friend," she said, "long before you two married, long before she got sick." Daniel blinked, stunned. "She came to me when things began to decline," Maya continued, her voice steady and reverent. "And she asked me for one thing, that if anything happened, I would be here, for your children." Her eyes softened, and her next words hit him harder than anything else. "And for you." The silence that followed wasn't stillness. It was revelation. It was a door opening inside him, too bright, too sudden, illuminating everything he had refused to see. Daniel looked down at the necklace, then at Maya, then at the floor, and he understood that nothing he had felt so far compared to the beginning of the truth now rising to the surface. Daniel stood in front of the necklace, as if facing a truth he had avoided touching for far too long. There was something brutal in the way such a small object carried more weight than any memory he had held onto of his wife. He didn't understand why it shook him this deeply, maybe because it was the first thing in months that pulled him out of the emotional numbness he had wrapped himself in to survive. Maya waited. Not nervously, not comfortably, but consciously, like someone who knew that any word spoken too quickly could turn the moment into something irreversible. "She trusted you with this?" Daniel asked, his voice low, strained, each word sounding like it cost him something. "She trusted me long before she realized she would need to," Maya answered. There was a painful gentleness to her tone, like touching that memory meant touching a wound that had never healed. The illness began progressing in ways she tried to hide. "And when she saw she wouldn't be able to protect you from what was coming, she came to me." Daniel braced his hands against the desk, trying to steady his breath. It wasn't just the content of her revelation. It was the way it dismantled the story he had built about his own wife, a woman who, as far as he knew, shared everything with him. But not this. "Why didn't she tell me?" he asked, and the question wasn't directed at Maya. It was spoken into the growing presence of an absence he had avoided acknowledging. "She didn't want you to carry more than you already were," Maya said softly. "She told me you had a way of hurting yourself quietly, and that if she told you, you'd try to save her no matter what, even when there was nothing left to save." Daniel closed his eyes and felt the words hit him physically, like pressure tightening inside his chest. Maya continued, her voice even lower now. "She asked me to stay close. She didn't know how or when. But she wanted me here when the time came. She wanted the boys to feel loved, even when she couldn't give that to them anymore." Daniel opened his eyes slowly, looking at her. She wasn't lying. There was no dramatic tremor, no forced emotion, no inconsistencies. Just a grief almost as old as his own, "And why did you agree?" he asked, his voice sounding strange even to him. It wasn't accusation, it was vulnerability. Maya drew a breath, a long, aching one. "Because I owed her that," she said, "and because I loved her." She corrected herself quickly. "Not the way you're thinking. I loved her for who she was, for her strength, for the way she saw the world." Daniel didn't speak for a long moment. He wanted to ask more. He wanted to unravel everything. He wanted to understand who exactly this woman in front of him really was, and who the woman he thought he knew had been. But before he could ask, a sound broke through the quiet, something falling in the hallway. Then a child's muffled cry. Maya instinctively took a step toward the door, but Daniel lifted a hand, almost without thinking. "Wait, I'll go." She stopped, surprised not by the words, but by the instinct behind them. Daniel stepped out and found the younger boy sitting on the floor, holding one of his favorite toys, the toy his wife had sewn just weeks before she died. The boy looked up, his expression confused, unsure whether he'd done something wrong. Daniel crouched down, slowly, without tension. "Did you get hurt?" he asked. The boy shook his head, tears gathered in his eyes. I wanted to show you that we drew Mom. And Maya too, because we like both of them." Daniel felt the familiar pressure rise in his chest, the one that always came when memories of his wife surfaced. But there was something new mixed in now, something he couldn't define. "Come here," he murmured, pulling his son into a hug, maybe the first real embrace in weeks. While holding him, Daniel noticed Maya standing quietly at the end of the hallway, leaning against the wall, watching with the same softness she carried through the entire house. Not intrusion, not competition, care. And that, for Daniel, was perhaps the hardest part. When he returned to the office, Maya was standing by the desk, waiting, as if she knew the conversation wasn't over, and that they had crossed a point of no return. "I never wanted to hide this from you," she said, "but I didn't want to crush you with everything at once." Daniel studied her for a long moment. He wanted to feel anger, but he couldn't. He wanted to push her away, but something held him back. He wanted to regain control, but the path to that felt impossibly unclear. She was here because his wife had asked her. She was here because she knew the boys. She was here because she carried a piece of his story he never even knew existed. "Why now?" he asked. "Why tell me this only now?" Maya looked away slightly, choosing her words as if they were delicate glass. "Because you only just started seeing," she said. "Until now, you weren't ready to hear." Her words cut through him, slow, precise. Because she was right. And that made everything harder. The truth was here now, finally spoken aloud. But truths this big never came alone. They carried consequences. Consequences he wasn't ready to face. And others he couldn't yet imagine. And from that moment on, the house would no longer be just a setting. It would become the mirror of every truth that had been denied until now. Truth, when it finally breaks the surface, never arrives neatly. It doesn't settle in order. It erupts, quiet but disorienting, forcing everyone involved to gather the fragments and figure out what still makes sense. That's how the days unfolded. Daniel could no longer look at Maya the same way. Not because he doubted her, but because now he knew too much. And at the same time, not nearly enough. Questions layered themselves inside him, each one heavier than the last, each one evolving into a new uncertainty he wasn't sure he wanted to face. And while he wrestled with everything inside his own mind, the boys seemed completely unaffected. To them, Maya was still the steady, warm presence they had folded into their lives without hesitation. The oldest spoke of her naturally, as if she had always been part of the home. The youngest slept better when she told stories. Both laughed with her in a way Daniel hadn't heard since before his wife grew sick. This contrast, the chaos inside him and the calm inside the house, awakened something Daniel wasn't used to admitting: fear. One afternoon, he found Maya folding the boy's clothes and stopped at the doorway, silently watching. He didn't announce himself, didn't clear his throat. He simply watched the precision, the softness, the way her hands moved. She wasn't just restoring order. She was giving life back to things. A memory rose, sharp and involuntary. His wife, sitting at the edge of the bed, folding the boy's clothes the exact same way, with the same quiet attention. A shiver ran over Daniel's skin. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe it was just her way. Or maybe it was an echo of something older, something woven long before he ever noticed. When she finally sensed him there, Maya lifted her face slowly. "Do you need something?" she asked, not uncomfortable but clearly aware that he had been watching her more closely lately. Daniel took a long time to answer. "I don't know what to do with all of this," he admitted, more honest than anything he had said in months. Maya set a small shirt down gently and stepped closer, only enough so he wouldn't have to raise his voice. "I don't know either," she said softly, "but I'm here." It wasn't a confession. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't an invitation. It was simply the truth. They stood in silence for a moment, a silence not born from lack of words, but from the presence of something new forming between them, something neither could name. A bond that wasn't romantic, wasn't professional, just profoundly human. Two griefs recognizing each other, but Daniel wasn't ready for anything beyond confusion. He stepped back, intending to leave, when Maya added, "She really believed you were stronger than you thought you were. She said it often." He stopped at the doorway. "She talked about me?" he asked, voice nearly a whisper. "She did," Maya replied with a sad smile. "And she spoke with a kind of love and worry I've rarely seen." Daniel lowered his eyes as if the floor had suddenly become too fragile to stand on. "She never showed me the worst of it," he murmured. "It was the only way she knew how to protect you," Maya said softly, "even if, in the end, it created more distance than she meant to." Daniel had no answer. And maybe it was exactly the lack of answers that made the moment feel so devastating. That night, the rain began subtly, a soft warning, before growing into a steady storm marked by thunder that shook the windows. The boys were restless, like children always are when wind pushes through the cracks of an old house. Maya tried to calm them with a story, but the oldest kept getting up to check the doors. The youngest, clutching the toy his mother had sewn, seemed ready to cry at every new rumble. Daniel watched from the doorway, unsure whether to step in or let Maya handle things, as she had been doing for weeks. But something in her posture made him move closer. "I'll take care of them," he said, surprised at the firmness in his own voice. Maya looked at him with quiet astonishment, then stepped aside gently, making room for him. He sat at the edge of the bed, pulled both boys closer, and whispered about how storms were nothing more than the sky making too much noise for its own size. Something shifted in that instant. Maya watched with an expression that carried tenderness and something deeper, a quiet relief, as if she were witnessing the beginning of something the house had been waiting for. A father returning to his children, not through her, but by himself. Once the boys finally fell asleep, Maya turned to leave, but the house had one more movement to offer. A loud crack of thunder shook the lights, making them flicker. The boys stirred, and Daniel moved to close the window. Maya approached the younger one to tuck him in again, and that's when she noticed it. The sewn toy in his arms had a tear along the side, and inside something small lodged between the stitches, ready to fall. Maya touched it delicately, and a yellowed piece of paper slipped out. Her heart immediately quickened, and Daniel noticed. "What is that?" he asked. Maya didn't answer right away, and when she finally lifted her eyes, Daniel saw something shift in her expression. It wasn't fear, it wasn't shock, it was recognition. "This wasn't here yesterday," she whispered. Daniel stepped closer, trying to understand, but she was already taking the paper into her hands, stepping away as if needing space. I need to see this in the living room," she said, unable to hide the tremor in her voice. And in that moment, something heavy settled in the air, the weight of an impending truth. Daniel didn't know it yet, but whatever was inside that piece of paper, something his wife had hidden before she died, was the missing piece. The piece that would make everything, absolutely everything, finally align. And the house, with almost cruel timing, had chosen that stormy night to reveal it. The living room was swallowed by an uneven darkness when they came downstairs. Outside, the storm kept striking the windows with a kind of deliberate force, as if the sky were pressing down on the house, demanding that everything inside it finally come to light. Maya walked ahead, the slip of paper held in both hands, as if it was something too fragile to be touched without reverence. Daniel followed a few steps behind her, watching the way she avoided looking directly at whatever was written there, as though she were gathering the courage to face something she had always known existed but never wanted to confirm. When they reached the living room, Maya stopped near the bookshelf, where memories, photos, trinkets, and pieces of the life Daniel once had rested in their quiet, familiar places. The house seemed to be watching them. "Should we sit?" Daniel asked. No urgency. No authority, just a man needing to understand what was about to unfold. Maya nodded, though her hands continued trembling faintly. They sat on the couch, and for a few seconds the only movement in the room was the steady percussion of rain against the windows. "Do you want to open it first?" Daniel asked. She didn't answer right away. I think this was meant for you," she whispered. "Not for me." Still, she held on to the paper as if protecting it. Daniel extended a hand. She hesitated, long enough for him to see that this moment tore her open too, and then she passed him the note, already unfolded. The paper was yellowed, aged, hidden away for months, maybe longer, maybe from before she died. The handwriting was unmistakable. His chest tightened so abruptly he felt his entire body stiffen. It was hers, his wife's. Daniel took a few seconds before finding the courage to read. The handwriting was slightly unsteady, the kind left by someone tired, but still writing with love. "I know the future will be hard. I know I'll leave too soon and that it will crush all of you. But please, don't let the house die with me." Daniel exhaled shakily, his hands trembling. "If you found this letter, it means the toy split open, and that would only happen after I was gone. Don't feel guilty. I only wanted to leave a little piece of myself where you would always be." He stopped. The air felt too heavy to breathe. Maya watched him, not with pity but with respect. He continued, "Daniel, I know you. You'll shut down. You've always carried the weight of the world in silence." The paper nearly slipped from his hands. "I know you'll try to move forward without feeling anything, thinking strength looks like that, but it doesn't. Be gentle with yourself. Be gentle with the boys. They will need you more than ever." Daniel closed his eyes, fighting the urge to fall apart entirely. When he opened them again, he read the next line slowly, voice cracking. "And Maya." He froze. For a moment he couldn't continue. Maya covered her mouth with one hand, as if something had struck her straight in the chest. Daniel forced himself to go on. "If you're reading too, thank you for coming when I asked. Thank you for not letting me face the fear alone." Maya's breath faltered. She placed her hands on her knees, grounding herself. I know giving you this letter places a burden I never wanted to give. But all I wanted was for them to have someone who still believed in the softness of life. Each word seemed to seep into the cracks of Daniel's grief. The room felt smaller. The world felt smaller. Everything seemed to fit inside that letter, a truth he wasn't prepared to hold. He read on. I chose you because I knew you would never set foot in this house to replace anyone. You've always understood that love doesn't work that way. Maya closed her eyes, letting the ache move freely through her. Take care of each other, all of you, not to erase my absence, but to honor what I couldn't finish. The final line was devastating in its simplicity. With love, always. The letter slipped from Daniel's lap as he sat frozen, trying to understand how someone could love deeply enough to plan their own goodbye with such tenderness. The house fell into absolute silence. Maya lifted a hand to her face. She didn't break down, not in the way grief sometimes explodes. It was a quiet cry, a deep one, born from a place words couldn't touch. Daniel raised his eyes toward her. How long have you known? He asked softly, without accusation. Since before I agreed to come, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She told me what she hoped. I just never imagined how much it would hurt. Daniel glanced at the letter, then back at her. Why didn't you show me this before? Because you wouldn't have known what to do with it, she answered honestly. You weren't ready to face anything that reminded you of her final days. He didn't argue. He knew she was right. Outside, the rain started to ease, as if the storm had completed its purpose. But inside the house, another storm had just begun, not one that shatters windows, one that shatters certainty. Something moved inside Daniel, something he didn't know if it was guilt, gratitude, or simply the return of a pain he had pushed too far away for too long. And now? He asked, almost to himself. Maya inhaled slowly before answering. Now, you decide what to do with the truth. A long, suspended silence filled the room. Then from the hallway, a soft sound. The boys, awakened by the calm after the storm, calling for their family, not for their mother, not only for their father, not only for Maya, for all of them. Daniel rose, wiped his face, and when he looked at her again, something had shifted in his eyes. Not certainty, not resolve, but the beginning of acceptance. Shall we go to them? He asked. Maya nodded. And together they walked into the hallway, not as employer and employee, not as strangers connected by someone else's dying wish, but as two adults carrying the same grief beneath the same roof, finally allowing the house to breathe with the full truth. The climax didn't come with a scream or an explosion. It came with recognition. And now, with the letter revealed, the house would never be the same. The boys were sitting on the bed in the larger room, half awake, half lost in the lingering rumble of the storm. When Daniel and Maya stepped inside, both children lifted their heads instantly, searching for the kind of safety adults often hide behind quiet walls. Daniel moved first. It wasn't calculated, it wasn't measured, it was instinct, the kind that rises when something finally shifts inside a person. He sat between them and wrapped his arms around their small bodies in a gesture he hadn't offered in a long time, letting his presence speak before any words could. "We're here," he murmured. Simple words, but for the first time in months, they were true. Maya remained by the doorway for a moment, watching without stepping in. She was a complete presence, and a discreet one, not claiming space, not overshadowing anything, just witnessing. When Daniel eventually looked up at her, the expression in his eyes didn't ask for help or answers or explanations. It simply met hers, without walls. The boys drifted back to sleep, this time held not by silence, but by the quiet certainty that someone was taking care of them, all of them. Later that night, the house glowed with soft lamps, and the storm had retreated to a distant whisper behind the windows. Daniel sat in the living room, the letter resting in his hands. It felt lighter than before, as if grief had loosened its hold just enough to let something else take its place, something still bitter, but no longer sharp. Maya appeared quietly in the doorway. She didn't announce herself. She simply allowed herself to be seen. "Do you want me to leave?" she asked, sincere without heaviness. Daniel stared at her for a long time. The answer wasn't simple. Maybe it never would be. But the way she stood there without crossing the threshold made the decision clear. "No," he said. The word carried no urgency and no desperation. It was simply recognition, the acknowledgement that her presence wasn't accidental, and that her absence would now be a real loss. Maya exhaled softly, as if releasing a breath she had held for months. "I only wanted to do what she asked of me," she said. "I didn't come here to take anyone's place." "I know," Daniel replied. "But you gave back something I thought was gone." "What was it?" she whispered. "The house." Maya looked away, emotion tightening her features for a brief moment. Not pride, not triumph. Gratitude, tangled with an old ache, the ache of fulfilling a promise made at the edge of someone else's ending. Daniel stood, walking toward her slowly. No hurry, no tension. When he reached her, he wasn't the employer, wasn't the suspicious man, wasn't the widower drowning in his own silence. He was someone finally seeing the full story. He handed her the letter. "You should read it again, too," he said softly. "She wrote it for both of us." Maya took the paper, and for a moment, brief, delicate, their fingers touched. Nothing more. No extra gesture, no step beyond what was natural, but in that touch there was understanding, and a space forming between them, not as replacement, but as continuation. Outside, the backyard still glistened from the rain, and the air carried that rare scent of earth and change. Daniel and Maya stepped onto the porch, letting the house rest behind them. The neighbors' lights reflected across the wet pavement, and the shadows of trees swayed in the leftover wind. The night no longer threatened, it simply remained. "Do you think she imagined it would be like this?" Daniel asked, staring into the yard as if searching for traces of his wife in the world she left behind. Maya took her time answering, and when she spoke, her words were chosen with care, like returning something precious. She imagined you'd need someone who wasn't afraid of silence, someone who wouldn't run from pain, someone who could look at this house and still see life. Daniel lowered his gaze, the weight of comprehension settling over him. "I failed her for so long," he murmured. Maya shook her head gently. "You didn't fail. You suffered, and suffering isn't failure. It's human." The wind moved between them, offering a pause. "And now?" Daniel asked for the second time that night. "Now you breathe," she answered, "in whatever way you can, in whatever way feels true." He looked at her then, really looked, without shields. "Will you stay?" Maya held the silence for a moment, and that moment spoke volumes. Not indecision, not fear, respect for the question and for the man who asked it. "I will," she said softly, "as long as you need, and as long as I can help." Daniel nodded with an understanding that didn't promise a future, didn't rewrite the past, and didn't try to turn grief into romance. It was simply acknowledgement of care, of presence, of something quietly rebuilt. The night grew still. The house breathed with them, not like before, not like a place wounded by loss, but with a new balance, fragile, sincere, the kind that exists only when the whole truth has finally been spoken. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, And the image that came wasn't the end, or the absence, or the grief. It was a family, not as replacement, but as reconstruction. And for the first time since his wife died, he felt a small, steady peace. A peace that didn't erase anything, but gently rearranged everything. The story didn't end here, but the sharpness of the pain finally stepped aside, and the house, at last, began to feel like home again. If this story found you at the right moment, tell us in the comments which city you're watching from. We love knowing how far our stories travel and how they touch each person in each place. May your day move with gentleness, with the same quiet peace this family rediscovered. May you find new beginnings where you once saw only endings, and may the stillness of this story stay with you for the steps ahead.